Okay, we're talking about personality, and contemporary psychologists believe that there are five basic dimensions of personality. We often call these the big five personality traits. You can see them on the screen, and I'm actually going to give you a helpful acronym, OCEAN, O-C-E-A-N, to help you remember each of the traits. So the O stands for openness, the C for conscientiousness, the E for extroversion, the A for agreeableness, and the N for neuroticism. So those are the big five, and I want you to keep in mind that each of these five personality factors represents a range between two extremes. Okay, so you see the characteristic in the middle, and you can score low on that characteristic or you can score high. So in the real world, most people lie somewhere in between these two polar ends. Yes, it's possible for somebody to score absolutely the lowest on a trait and absolutely the highest, but most people are some kind of a combination of both of the traits. We fall somewhere along this continuum. Okay, so in the next few slides, of course, we're going to talk about each of the traits, and I want you to be thinking a little bit about yourself, about where you might fall on that continuum. Okay, the first trait is openness, and this refers to openness to experience. So if you score high in openness, it's really focusing on this general appreciation for art, emotion, adventure, ideas, imagination, curiosity, and a variety of experiences. So when you score high on this, you're curious, you're open to emotion, you're sensitive to beauty, you want to try new things, and more creative, more aware of feelings, and even tend to hold more onto unconventional beliefs. And people who score lower on openness tend to be, get their fulfillment through more of like perseverance, and they're more pragmatic, they're more data driven. So you can see like highs and lows where we tend to fall on this openness. If you're very open, you're extremely creative, try new things, tackle new challenges, like abstractions. And if you score low, you tend not to like change, not to enjoy new things, tending to resist ideas, not as creative or imaginative, and disliking in abstractions. Okay, our next trait is conscientiousness, a word that I just absolutely hate spelling, but conscientiousness refers to our tendency to display self-discipline, something that we've talked about quite a bit in this class. Also to have dutiful actions, and also striving for achievement against any kind of an outside expectation. So this really deals with the way in which we as individuals control and regulate and direct our impulses. So if you score high on conscientiousness, this is kind of a preference for planning, right, rather than spontaneous behavior. And if you score low on conscientiousness, it's a hard word to say too, conscientiousness, it's more about you tend to be more flexible and spontaneous. So let's look at the difference between high and low. So if you're high on this trait, you spend time preparing, you finish the important tasks right away, you're detail-oriented, and you like planning, calendar, set schedule. And if you score low on conscientiousness, you tend to not like structure and schedules. You make a little bit of messes and maybe aren't as organized with things, maybe don't return things back to where they're supposed to go, procrastinates even on important tasks, and also sometimes fails to complete those tasks. Much more on the spontaneous, roll with the punches, go with the flow kind of thought pattern. The next trait is extroversion, and in some places you'll see extroversion spelled with an A, sometimes you'll see it spelled with an O. They're actually both correct, but extroversion is basically characterized by this engagement with the external world. So extroverts love interacting with people. They're often perceived to be, just absolutely full of energy. They're enthusiastic. They're action-oriented, right? They have very high group visibility. They like to talk. They like to assert themselves. And in social settings, they often appear dominant when compared to their introverted compadres, right? So on the low end, what it would be called was, of course, an introvert or introversion, and those are the ones that have, lower social engagement and energy levels when compared to extroverts. So they're quieter, more low-key, more deliberate, and less interacting with the external world. So don't think of it as shyness or depression or anything like that. It's not about that. It's more that introverts are more independent of their social world than extroverts. They need less stimulation because their stimulation is already very high in their own minds. They need more alone time than extroverts. So again, introversion does not mean that they are unfriendly. It doesn't mean they're antisocial. It just means that they're more reserved in social circumstances. So of course, generally people are a combination of these two. It is a continuum, but we can have people that tend more to the end of introversion and some that are more towards extroversion. So again, highs and lows. If you score high on extroversion, you like being the center of attention, you like starting conversations and meeting people, you have a very wide circle of friends, you find it easy to make friends, you're energized when you're around people and ideas and events, and you tend to say things before thinking. On the low end of extroversion, and this would be introversion, you prefer solitude. If you spend a lot of time in that external environment, you feel exhausted by it, your batteries are drained, find it difficult or dislike starting conversations or making small talk. You do think about things before speaking, and you don't necessarily like being the center of attention. So that's the difference between the two types, extroversion and introversion. Okay, our next trait is called agreeableness, and this is a social trait, and it reflects basically individual differences in concern for, I would say, social harmony. And so people who score high on agreeableness really value harmony and getting along with other people. They're generally very considerate and kind and generous and trusting and trustworthy. They're helpful. They oftentimes compromise their interest when working or dealing with other people. They're fairly optimistic as well. So low on agreeableness, individuals, they usually place the self-interest, their own self-interest above getting along with others. They're not as concerned with others' well-being. They're less likely to extend themselves for other people, right? So a lot of times the less agreeableness can be a little bit more competitive, a little bit more challenging. So let's look at the high and low agreeableness. So if you're high on agreeableness, you have a great deal of interest in others, you care for other people, you really score high on empathy and concern, you like helping, you like making other people happy, you like assisting other people. But if you score low on agreeableness, it's not so important to you to take care of others, not necessarily thinking about how other people feel or harmony, little interest in others, including their problems. Now, on the extreme end, of course, might insult or belittle other people or manipulate others. So that's on the very, very lowest end. Again, keep in mind this is a continuum. You can score low in agreeableness and not necessarily have to manipulate and belittle others, but you just are indifferent to other people's issues. So remember, it is a continuum. And our last trait is called neuroticism, and this is the tendency to experience negative emotions like anger, anxiety, depression. We can sometimes refer to this as emotional instability. So people who score high on neuroticism are usually a little bit more, when we talked about emotional intelligence, a little bit more emotionally reactive, a little bit more vulnerable to stress. Sometimes they take something that might be an ordinary event, they see it as kind of threatening, or if they have some frustrations, they see life as kind of hopelessly difficult. They might be a little bit more flippant about how they express their emotions to others, and when they're kind of the negative emotional state occurs over a time period, they can be seen to be in a bad mood a lot of times, right? So if a person scores high in neuroticism, it's really, when we talked about emotional intelligence, it's really interfering with their ability to think clearly, make decisions, and cope with stress. So of course, a side effect of this is people who have high levels of neuroticism generally have lower levels of psychological well-being. All right. Now, individuals who have high neuroticism also tend to have more negative life events, but that changes in response to the positive and negative life events. It depends, of course. Now, at the other end of the scale, the low neuroticism, right? These are people who get less easily upset. They're less emotionally reactive. They tend to be calm, emotionally stable. They don't have that persistent negative feeling. It doesn't mean that they only experience positive feelings, but it's just that they're not emotionally unstable by it. Okay, so neuroticism, if you're high, a lot of stress, worrying about a lot, upset very easily, dramatic mood shifts, anxiety, and have trouble being resilient and bouncing back. If you score low on neuroticism, you tend to be more stable, you deal with stress better, you rarely feel sad or depressed, you don't worry as much, and are more calm, more relaxed. Okay, so we just briefly reviewed the big five, and of course now we need to assess ourselves. So that first step, we need to take a big five personality test that has some sample questions that tell us or help tell us which end of the continuum we tend to fall in for each of the five traits. But we also need to reflect on ourselves in, our academic lives, our professional lives, our personal lives, and we need to think about, how we think, how we feel, how we behave, and we need to brainstorm some of examples of our preferences, which end of the spectrum we tend to fall on, right? And obviously you guys are going to be doing that this week for your activity. So I wanted to share with you just to give you an example, right? So when I take the big five test, according to the activity I'm going to give you, you can take different types of tests. You can see my scores, right? So conscientiousness on the level, I got 40 out of 40, which means I really am on that polar very high. I am extremely conscientious, guys. So essentially you could say I have 100%. So I'm very high. That is a high trait for me. Agreeableness is also high. It's 37 out of 40, right? Like a 93%. So I do tend to want to harmonize and get along with others. My openness, I would say, is moderate, like about 85%. My extroversion, you can see there 20 out of 40. That's like 50% average. I am actually an introvert, guys, but I'm an extrovert when I'm doing things that I'm passionate about or when I'm in certain settings, like in my professional world. All my students think I'm this huge extrovert, right? So if you ever read a book I highly recommend is Susan Cain's book called Quiet, and it talks about introverts and extroverts, and a lot of times introverts behave as if they were extroverts out in the real world. So that's why everybody thinks I'm an extrovert. Most of my students, about 99%, would say I'm an extrovert. People who see me out in the world say I'm an extrovert, but in reality I am an introvert. I assess myself more on the introversion end of the scale. But there's also the middle ground. It's called an ambivert, somebody who's kind of half introvert, half extrovert. And then neuroticism, I score fairly low on that, although I do have moments where I do worry. I can still be a worrywart. So yes, the first step is identification. But do keep in mind, guys, that we're not taking this assessment or any assessment in this class to pigeonhole ourselves into a personality type or to say that this is a rigid, never-changing element or set of elements for us. We are human beings and we express our thoughts and our feelings and our actions in different ways. So no, we can't be put in a box. And so always keep in mind that these traits are on a continuum. There are no absolutes, right? But where we generally fall on most days does give us insight into our lives about how we think and how we feel and how we behave. And it does matter in terms of how we go about things academically, professionally, and personally. So knowing some of these personality traits helps us in deciding a major. It helps us in deciding future career options. It also informs us how we go about doing things in our lives, whether all the roles that we play, right, as parents or siblings, friends, co-workers, partners, and so on. So just like everything else and all the other assessments that we've done in this class, the more we know about ourselves, the better we do, the better decisions that we can make for our futures.